The summer of 1972 was a transitional time for King Crimson's guitarist and bandleader, Robert Fripp. In the spring of 1972, the then current version of King Crimson, the version of the band that had produced the 1971 album Islands, had broken up. Robert Fripp and King Crimson's lyricist, Peter Sinfield, had had a falling out, with Fripp dismissing Sinfield from the band in January of '72. The rest of the band walked out in protest, only to be reminded by their management at EG Records that the band was committed to a North American tour in the spring of 1972. The band lived up to that commitment, with Robert Fripp, in something of a form of protest, releasing a live album from the tour, Earthbound, which was of such poor sound quality that it was not even released in North America. Island Records, who distributed EG in the UK, would release the album as a budget-priced item. By July of '72, after Earthbound's release, Robert Fripp had begun making arrangements to assemble a new lineup of King Crimson, including the ex-Yes drummer Bill Bruford, Family's ex-bassist and vocalist John Wetton, violinist and keyboard player David Cross, and percussionist Jamie Muir. The news that that version of King Crimson would be ready to begin rehearsals soon was provided to the press in late July of 1972. Rehearsals, however, would not begin until September due to another commitment that Robert Fripp had. Fripp had been, over the course of King Crimson's existence, interested in session work and in record production, and had participated in various projects on those fronts. He had worked on sessions with Van der Graaf Generator on their albums H to He and Pawn Hearts, and in conjunction with his friends Keith Tippett and Tippett's wife Julie Driscoll, produced an album for their project Centipede in 1971. One of the participants in the Centipede project was the ex-Soft Machine drummer Robert Wyatt. Wyatt, following the Centipede sessions, had begun work on a project with a new band called Matching Mole. And Wyatt had asked Fripp if he would be interested in producing what would become Matching Mole's second album, Matching Mole's Little Red Record. Wyatt had left Soft Machine as a result of that band's growing apart and becoming less interested in his songwriting and compositions. And Wyatt sensed that the same thing was happening to some degree with Matching Mole. It turned out he was right. Matching Mole would split up not long after the sessions for the second album were complete. But Wyatt enlisted Fripp's insistence, thinking that Fripp, who was somewhat methodical in his approach, would be a good producer for keeping the project on track. And so Fripp agreed to participate in the project, where most of the recording for the Little Red Record would take place in August of 1972, just prior to the beginning of the new version of King Crimson's starting rehearsals. In addition to the members of Matching Mole, another player would turn up at the sessions, Brian Eno. Fripp was familiar with Eno's reputation with Roxy Music. Roxy Music recorded for the same record label as King Crimson did, EG Records, and their first album had come out a month or so before the Matching Mole sessions in June of 1972, the album produced by Pete Sinfield, in fact. In addition, Fripp had, prior to the Islands version of King Crimson coming together in early 1971, had auditioned Roxy Music's lead singer Brian Ferry as a possible player in that King Crimson lineup. I suspect, though, that Fripp was a bit surprised to see Brian Eno on hand for a session job. Brian Eno, by his own admissions in the music press, was not very much of a musician. he tended to view his work as providing backing vocals and treatments of various instruments through electronics. And the style of Roxy Music's musical compositions was also a bit different from those of Matching Mole as well. At the time, I suspect that Fripp had guessed that Eno was brought on board to the sessions by Robert Wyatt. Wyatt and Eno had crossed paths in art school prior to the two of them getting involved in the music business. In addition, Matching Mole's bassist, Bill McCormick, was a long-standing friend of Roxy Music's guitar player, Phil Manzanera, so there might have been something of a connection there as well. In any event, Fripp established something of a camaraderie with Brian Eno upon the sessions. Fripp found that Eno was very interested in the EMS VCS-3 synthesizer, an instrument that Pete Sinfield had used to great effect in King Crimson near the end of Sinfield's tenure with the band. And he also discovered that Eno was interested in experimental music. In particular, Eno was very interested in some of the experiments that the American musician Terry Riley had performed using tape machines as a musical instrument of sorts. And so during the Matching Mole sessions, Fripp and Eno agreed to get together and collaborate basically for fun in the near future. And indeed, they would meet at Eno's home about a week and a half later after the Matching Mole sessions completed in early September of 1972. At Eno's home that day, Fripp and Eno created a seminal composition in the field of ambient music, one that in essence formed the basis for Fripp's later experimentation with reel-to-reel tape machines that he dubbed Frippertronics. The composition they created on September 8, 1972, was the Heavenly Music Corporation, 21 minutes worth of music produced by Eno's tape machines connected in series that would, on the first pass, allow music played by Fripp to cascade an echo that would repeat and repeat at lower volumes as one tape machine picked up what the other was playing. Following creation of this first pass of the music, the tape was rewound and then played back with Fripp playing a guitar solo over it to complete the piece of music. As I said, the Heavenly Music Corporation is a very well-regarded piece of music. However, neither Fripp nor Eno had time to consider doing anything further together beyond that initial experiment. Eno had plans to go on tour with Roxy Music, first for some dates in the UK and then subsequently for their first North American dates in late 1972. At the same time, of course, Fripp needed to get to work with his new version of King Crimson to rehearse and begin building a repertoire. So nothing further happened between Fripp and Eno for some time. Fripp and Eno would next cross paths about a year later, in August of 1973. By then, the worlds of both King Crimson and Roxy Music had changed quite a bit. King Crimson had had a very strong start following their late 1972 rehearsals, enjoying a series of well-attended and positively reviewed shows in the UK in the end of 1972. The new King Crimson would record their first album together in early 1973, the album Lark's Tongues and Aspic, released in March of 1973. Lark's Tongues and Aspic was a critical success, and King Crimson's tour of North America in the spring of '73 was successful as well, giving them strong support from both Island Records, with whom EG Records were associated in the UK, and from Atlantic Records, EG's North American distributor. Roxy Music was successful too. They recorded their second album, For Your Pleasure, in early 1973, following their North American tour. An interesting coincidence, For Your Pleasure and Lark's Tongues and Aspic were released on the same day, March 23rd, 1973. For Your Pleasure, produced by George Martin's protege at Air Studios, Chris Thomas, was an album that felt quite a bit different from its predecessor. Chris Thomas was a well-established producer with credentials going back to his supporting of various Beatles recordings at Abbey Road Studios under George Martin's tutelage. Perhaps just as importantly, however, was that Brian Eno had taken a much larger role in the recording of For Your Pleasure versus what he did on Roxy Music's first album. For Your Pleasure incorporates Eno's tape loops, synthesizer treatments, and other contributions on several of the album's more prominent songs, including In Every Dream Home a Heartache and the album's title song, which is very much supported as far as the mood the song creates by Eno's tape loops and special effects. Eno's contributions to the album, as well as his flamboyant stage appearance, caused a rift in the band between Eno and Roxy Music's lead singer, Brian Ferry, who very much viewed the band as his own. Ultimately, things would come to a head between Eno and Ferry, and by July of 1973, it was agreed in principle that Brian Eno would leave Roxy Music. And so, in August of 73, Eno's situation had changed rather substantially. He was in a bit of debt based on his work with Roxy. He owed EG Records some £15,000. And he also, by virtue of not being a strong musician in his own right, was a bit worried about how he might go forward. He did, however, during July and August of 73, begin working on new songs that he thought would ultimately find their way to a Brian Eno solo album. In reconciling with Fripp, the first thing that Eno and Fripp decided to do was to continue some of their experimentation. They would book time together at Command Studios, where Fripp had made Logs, Tongues, and Aspic with King Crimson, to construct a second piece incorporating Eno's tape loop technology. But this time, instead of using Fripp's guitars to establish a basis of background for the composition, Eno would put his VCS-3 synthesizer to work and created a more dense soundscape over which Fripp would be able to solo. This work resulted in another long track, almost 19 minutes in length, which Fripp and Eno would call Swastika Girls, named after an article in a pornographic magazine that either Fripp or Eno found at Air Studios, where they had pursued mixing of the album. Fripp and Eno were proud of their work and wanted it to see release. But at the same time, however, Eno was receiving pressure from EG Records to begin work in earnest on a solo album. And Fripp, along with John Wetton's bass player, King Crimson, would be among the participants in that effort. Eno would assemble about a dozen or so musicians at the sessions for what would become his first solo album, called Here Come the Warm Jets. Eno would joke to the press, following the album's release, that he had deliberately enlisted musicians for the album that he felt would be incompatible with one another as far as their playing styles were concerned, and he wanted to see what types of happy accidents might result. I do think this was something of a joke, in the sense that Eno was fairly serious about what he was wanting to create, at least as far as the moods of the music that were being created. Eno has said on various occasions that his approach to songwriting wasn't terribly deliberate, that sometimes it would take him less time to write a song than it would take him to deliver it in the studio. That his approach was much more along the lines of constructing sounds that worked well together rather than constructing lyrics that had any specific meaning to them. And to a certain degree, that's evident in Here Come the Warm Jets. The songs are melodic, they sound good, they create a mood, but they don't necessarily say very much of importance. Here Come the Warm Jets, which was recorded in September of 1973, consists of two very different sides of music. The first side of the album contains the shorter songs that Eno might have thought, or perhaps that the record company might have thought, would work better for radio airplay or as singles. And the songs are constructed on the album in a conventional manner with fade-outs or closes that are very distinct from one song to the next. Side 2 of the album, however, is mostly a continuous seg from song to song, with most of the songs on side 2 segueing one into the next with a seamless transition, so as to provide an overall effect for the 22 minutes of music on the side. The songs on side 1 are, in fact, the more familiar ones as far as radio airplay is concerned. The album opens with a song that Brian Eno wrote with Roxy Music's guitarist Phil Manzanera, called Needles in the Camel's Eye. Bill McCormick, Phil Manzanera's friend from Matching Mole, also participates on this track. The second track of the album, whose name I won't say out loud here for political correctness reasons, is one where Manzanera also participates and provides a great, if somewhat simplistic, guitar solo. Probably the most familiar song on Here Come the Warm Jets, however, is the third one, Baby's on Fire. Baby's on Fire is about 5.5 minutes long, with about the first minute and a half of the song dedicated to the primary vocal section of the track, which is then followed by an incendiary 3-minute-long guitar solo provided by Robert Fripp. In interviews after the fact, Fripp would say that the solo was done in a single take after he had gotten to the studio, pretty much coming directly from the airport after having flown transatlantic from the United States back to London for the recording session. Fripp would also note that in addition to his jet lag, he was also suffering from the flu and had something of a fever when he recorded this terrific solo. Baby's on Fire is one of the songs from Brian Eno's early repertoire that would find its way into live settings, regardless of who the other musicians on stage were with Eno. One of the more famous deliveries of the song is on Eno's and Phil Manzanera's great live album from a few years later, 801 Live. The next song on side 1, Cindy Tells Me, is something of a 50s pastiche. Again, this is a co-write that Eno did with Phil Manzanera. The final track on side 1, Driving Me Backwards, features Robert Fripp, along with John Wetton on bass. Wetton appears on Baby's on Fire with Fripp as well. Driving Me Backwards is, more than anything else, a showcase for Eno's production technique, with several of the backing tracks indeed presented to the listener in backward sequence in order to present the song in a way that is gripping to the listener's ear. As I said, side 2 of the album is definitely the more experimental one. On Some Faraway Beach, which opens side 2, is largely instrumental, featuring Roxy Music's horn man, Andy Mackay, playing keyboards for most of the track. It's not until about 3 minutes or so into the track that Eno's voice is slowly faded in, singing a lyric that is pretty much buried by the music that's presented. There is a quick transition from this track to the second one, Blank Frank, which features Robert Fripp, who also co-authored the track. This song is one that is very much based on the familiar Bo Diddley beat. In fact, one could argue that Ellis McDaniel probably deserved a songwriting credit because it is such a derivative track in that regard. It is probably the most lively track on side 2 from a vocal perspective. The track that follows, Blank Frank on side 2, is Dead Finks Don't Talk, which is a rather subdued track with a straightforward vocal by Eno until the song basically falls apart in distortion for about its last 20 seconds or so, before transitioning to the next track, Some of Us Are Old, which features some great slide guitar work from Eno's friend Lloyd Watson. The final track on the album, the title song, Here Come the Warm Jets, features music that almost sounds like it could be coming from kazoos. It's not really clear to me whether these tones are provided by synthesizers or by guitars. And in a way, I guess it doesn't matter. The tune of the song is carried from this instrumentation and done in a very strong fashion. Like On Some Faraway Beach, this song does not incorporate Eno's vocals until about 3 minutes in, and again, when the vocals arrive, they are faded in very slowly to the point where it almost doesn't register to the brain that there are words being sung with the vocals. At least I, for probably the first couple of years that I owned this album, going back to the 1970s, thought that the vocals were wordless. It wasn't until much later that I realized that there were actually lyrics being sung. Bottom line is, Here Come the Warm Jets is a very unique album. It's an album that probably couldn't have been made in 1973 by anyone other than Brian Eno. Certainly, there's not very much happening in the album that one would have anticipated from Eno's work with Roxy Music, except maybe from the closing section of For Your Pleasure on that album from Roxy Music, where Eno's work with special effects really does take center stage. With both Fripp and Eno's album, which would be given the title No Pussyfooting, and Here Come the Warm Jets being ready for distribution at about the same time, EG Records had something of a conundrum in terms of how to promote this music. They made what they felt was the only choice they could make, which was to promote Brian Eno's work as a solo artist first, and to, in particular, Robert Fripp's frustration, all but buried the No Pussyfooting album. In the UK, No Pussyfooting was released as a budget price release similar to King Crimson's Earthbound album. In North America, Island Records actually created a new experimental label, Antilles Records, at about this time, and assigned No Pussyfooting to that label rather than to the mainline Island Records imprint. No Pussyfooting, of course, in this day and age, is viewed as a landmark album in ambient and experimental music. And of course, Robert Fripp's Frippertronics technique came directly from the experiments on this album. I would dare say that the Heavenly Music Corporation is among the best of those experiments that found its way to an album, in part because it was done so spontaneously and with such enthusiasm by Fripp and Eno. That being said, Here Come the Warm Jets is a terrific album as well. It was not a big seller in North America by any stretch. I think it made number 151 on the Billboard charts. It did make the top 30 on the UK album charts, though, and established Eno as a serious artist outside of his work with Roxy Music. All this being said, I think these albums are probably most important in retrospect in that they established both Robert Fripp and especially Brian Eno as terrific music producers. Robert Fripp, of course, would be involved in producing many artists over the course of the 1970s, including perhaps most notably Peter Gabriel and Daryl Hall. Brian Eno would, of course, contribute to many sessions in the early 70s before graduating into production, working with, among others, David Bowie, Devo, Talking Heads, and U2. It's a great resume, to be sure. Anyway, that's my story for today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any comments, of course, feel free to leave those. I do my best to respond to them whenever possible. If you enjoyed the episode, please click like. And if you haven't subscribed to Propaganda yet, of course, please do that as well. We will see you again here soon. You take good care. Bye-bye.